Welcome to Very Interesting. I'm your substitute host, Philip Britt, sitting in for Barry Aycock today. I'm excited to welcome Reverend Brad Barton, the author of a series of books entitled The Enchanted Bell Tower, to Very Interesting today. Brad, welcome. Glad to have you with us.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
All right.
Actually honored to be here. You know, when I was writing this book, probably a lot of authors have the kind of things go through their head that I have go through my head, but what went through my head was I started thinking about all the interviews that I'd end up doing about the book series, and this is my first one.
Excellent. Well, we're glad to be your first one. So, Brad recently came into my life as his wife was called as our pastor at our church in Kennett, so we're thrilled to have you get to share with us today. So I really want to talk about the books and kind of what prompted them and your writing process, all that cool stuff. But first, tell me about Brad.
Okay, well, let's see, where do I start? Obviously, I'm a Christian and I'm a minister, and I always like to lead with that. But I am physically from Michigan. So I was born in Michigan, and then when I was a very young person, my family moved to Texas, and I was raised in the Dallas, Texas area. I aspired to be lots of different things, but ultimately I ended up going to school to be a businessman, and I spent a couple of years in business before meeting a young lady from Southeast Missouri. And I met her and I married her. Her name is Susan, and she is my wife, and she was going to be a minister, and upon meeting her and talking to her, I started remembering all these times when God had been calling me to be a minister. So I went down that path, and for many years, this is now the 20th year of our ordination, so I've been a minister for a long time. But about 10 years ago, I started writing the series of books that became the Enchanted Bell Tower series, and a couple of years ago, I left congregational ministry and I started writing full-time, and late in 2021, I published the first book, and now I'm on number 4.
All right, that's awesome. So these books were written for an adolescent audience.
Yes.
But I found them incredibly enjoyable. That either says something about your ability to write for multiple generational audiences or my intellect. I don't know which it is, but we'll assume it's your ability to write for them. But
I'd like to say that it's for me, but I think it's because God's stories are timeless, and all I try to do in the books is help people. You know, I write to a relatively young age, like I try to make it so a third grader can understand it, but I try to make it so that any person could understand the stories of the scripture, make them relevant to their lives.
So tell us a little bit about the books.
So the books are about 2 boys, David and Jonathan. My wife came up with the names, David and Jonathan, and they go into the stories of the Bible through this enchanted bell tower that is in First Christian Church, Dexter, Missouri, not very far from where we are sitting right now. And that's the general idea. The first book, in the first book, before the book starts, the kid's mother dies, and that causes them to go through some very difficult times. The family moves to Dexter, and they discover that their mother had taken these journeys into the bell tower, and then they start taking the similar journeys into the bell tower, and the books are about them bonding as brothers. It's about them dealing with problems that they're facing in their lives, and God works through the stories of Scripture and sometimes encounters them directly to help them solve the problems that they're facing.
They do face lots of challenges. You know, at their ages, you know, the older brother doesn't necessarily always like the younger brother being around, but he gets to be a part of this whole process too. And I think they needed each other to go there.
Absolutely did. And I got inspiration on that from my children. I have 2 boys who are about the same number of years apart as these 2, and they fought like cats and dogs, and they loved each other, and they're each other's best friends, and I got a lot of inspiration about watching my own children.
Have you always been a storyteller?
I have. Well, I say always, as far back as I can remember. When I was in 3rd grade, I remember rushing through all of my work that I had to do in class as fast as I could, and I got really bad penmanship grades because I was rushing so fast. And the reason I rushed through my work so fast is because after we got done with the work we had to do, then we were allowed to just write whatever we wanted to write. And at the end of the year, I didn't know it at the time, but they had compiled books for each of us of all the stories that we had written during the year. And every other kid's stories or books, they came out and they were about 1/4 of an inch thick. They had basically written the mandatory assignments. Mine was over 1.5 inches thick. And I just loved writing and being in this creative kind of headspace and thinking of a story and writing it down. Sometimes I would base them off of movies that I'd seen. Sometimes I would just come up with crazy stuff that my brother and I had talked about. But yeah, I've pretty much always been a storyteller.
Have you seen those stories in a long time?
About a year or two ago, I guess it was 2 years ago, when my wife and I were getting rid of everything, 2 years ago, I have to back up, we took a journey where we sold all of our stuff, we left our house, we moved into a tiny trailer, and we traveled across the United States. Well, in the process of doing that, I found a lot of things that I hadn't seen in many years, and one of them was that book. And so I looked back and I looked at those stories. Now, you got to understand, in my mind, I was a great storyteller when I was a 3rd grader. Reading those stories, I am laughing at myself really hard. I mean, oh my gosh, I was a terrible storyteller, but I guess for a 3rd grader, I was okay. I at least got used to putting the pencil or pen to paper and writing out my thoughts.
Did that carry on as a parent? Did you like to tell stories to your boys?
Oh yeah, I love to tell stories to my kids. Every time Susan and I went out, we looked for a new book to be able to buy so that we could read it to our kids. But of course, the kids wanted us to tell our own stories, and so we'd be driving down the road or whatever, and the kids would be bored, and they'd say, "Hey, Dad, tell us a story." So usually they wanted fantasy stories. So I would make up fantasy stories where my kids, their names are Cole and Josh, and they would be the stars of the story or the villains of the story, but somehow I incorporated them into the stories. And they could remember years later, they would ask me to continue a story that I couldn't even remember that I had started a couple years prior, but they were always wanting me to add to the story.
Well, that's amazing. So what made you decide you wanted to share this particular story with the world?
That's a good question. What happened is I was a minister. I was serving a congregation in St. Charles, Missouri, and I liked telling the stories of the Bible. That's something that I just really loved doing. And then I got sick. I got a chronic illness. And while the doctors were trying to figure out how to get me to where I could just function normally as a person, I realized I couldn't serve in a congregation anymore. So I told Susan that I needed to take some time away from congregational ministry. She went from being a chaplain, where she did a chaplaincy internship for a year, and she decided she was going to serve a congregation. That's how we ended up in Colorado. Well, I decided during my downtime, while I was trying to get better, I would try to write. And Susan and I were talking some about different stories that we talked about through the years, and she actually had come up with the idea for these 2 boys who traveled into the stories of the Bible using the bell tower at the church that she had grown up at, which is First Christian Church of Dexter, Missouri. And that's how I decided that I was like, wow, I just really love those characters. My kids at the time were of the age roughly of these kids, these boys that the stories are about, and I thought, yeah, I could write that. The kids give me inspiration, the Bible gives me inspiration. I didn't feel like I could be a congregational pastor, but I still wanted to spread God's word, and we ended up with the Enchanted Bell Tower series, or at least I should say half of the first book. I started writing it, I got sick again, then I got not sick again, and then after about half the book was written, I just set it down for another half a dozen years. And then all of a sudden, picked it back up again. And I thought, the publishing industry had finally gotten to a place where I felt like I could publish it on Amazon myself without having to go and find a publisher. And so I went out and got an editor. There was a lady in Florida, I think. Her name was Roseanne Catalano, and I sent her the manuscript. I finished it finally, sent her the manuscript, and she sent it back to me and said I had a lot of work to do as a writer to that particular age group. So then I put it on the shelf again. And then finally in 2021, when I realized that my ability to be a congregational pastor was kind of coming to an end, and I thought, I need to pick this book back up, and I need to write it, and that's what happened. So now, 2 years later, there are 4 books in the series, and there are going to be many, many more.
So you had some time, because that was about the same time that you all decided to leave and travel.
Yes, we decided to leave and travel specifically so that I could write and finish these books and publish these books.
And apparently it worked.
Yes, it definitely worked. I could even tell you where I was when I published the first book. When I hit that send button on Amazon, I was sitting at a Starbucks overlooking the bay in Corpus Christi, Texas.
Yeah, amazing.
Yeah, it was beautiful. We were traveling the country in beautiful spaces.
Where all did you all go during that time?
Well, first we wanted to visit our kids. They were adults. They had gone into the Air Force, so we went down to San Angelo, Texas to see Cole. We went out to Monterey, California to see Josh, and everywhere in between. We went up to Michigan because my family has a farm there still, and so we went up that way. We did some traveling around Missouri. We probably spent most of our time in Missouri and Texas because that's where our families were, but if you can think of Missouri, Texas, California, and Michigan, crisscrossing the country every place in between those spots.
Excellent. And folks out there probably really don't comprehend exactly what you say when you sold everything and got a trailer. And tell us about the trailer.
The trailer, we call it a bed on wheels. It is a 5-foot by 8-foot trailer with no amenities. Literally, you crawl in the door. You can't walk in the door. You crawl in the door, and there is a queen bed. Maybe it's a full bed. Yeah, I think the full-size bed, and that takes up the entirety of the inside of the trailer. There's a little bit of a galley in the back where we can keep supplies, but that's it. We were basically living outside but sleeping inside this trailer.
And I think you told me that one time. You said, we were having this conversation about the trailer, and you said, basically that's our bedroom and the world is our house.
Yep.
I mean, that's a pretty cool way to look at things.
Yeah, we thought of every state park that we went to, because we stay mostly in state parks, and every state park that we go to, we think of as our living room, and the world is our house, and that gave me a lot of inspiration for writing too.
Sure.
I got to see so many beautiful things, and it's helpful when I'm trying to come up with descriptive words to be able to see amazing trees, or a river, or a stream, or the ocean. I mean, it's just, it's great inspiration for writing.
Yeah, that's awesome. Well, you've written 4 books. I've read 3 of them. By the time this episode comes out, the 4th one should be available on Amazon.
Yep.
Is that where they can get them if they want to get one?
Yes, they can get them on Amazon.com. I have since found out that Amazon, even though I publish through Amazon, after they've been on their site for a while, they make them available at other places. So I think you can get them through Walmart's website and Barnes & Noble's website,
Awesome.
just about anywhere. But it's better for me if you
go
buy
through.
them from Amazon, because that's where I get the biggest royalties.
Gotcha. All right. Well, and if you like them, write a nice review and tell everybody to come and get them there. So
Definitely, if there's anything that I could use more than anything else, it's people reviewing the book and telling others honestly what they think of it. And I would like to say, you mentioned this earlier, they're really not just for kids.
Yeah.
I actually used the book as a Sunday school curriculum for a group of older adults in Ash Grove, Missouri, about a year ago, and this group of people who they weren't used to telling their own stories or talking very much with one another, through reading this book and answering some questions about it, they ended up getting to know each other really, really well, and it really elicited colorful conversation.
absolutely. That sounds like a great opportunity for a lot of us to learn more. And the stories help. I mean, I think the fact that you give these young men or these young boys an opportunity to interact with the characters, not just sit on the sidelines and see it happen, but actually to be able to interact with the characters. I think that's amazing. I think that's a really neat part of the story.
Well, thanks. I'm glad to hear you say that, because I really wrestled with whether or not
Sure.
that was the way it was going to work out.
Right.
When you're thinking about kids going into the stories of the Bible, some of the ideas that popped into my head were, are they really going back in time?
Right.
Are they just going into the story? And if they're going into the story but not actually being teleported through time, then what is the level of interaction with
Right.
the characters of the story? A lot of stuff that I had to think about and try to figure out what would help people best get these stories and make an impact for them.
Well, and it gives these young men, young boys, the challenge of, can we change what's getting ready to happen? We know we've heard this story and the ending's not good. Can we fix that? And and if they couldn't interact, that it wouldn't even be in their minds. So I think that's an interesting part of it too.
Thank you.
So I've always been an avid reader of fiction. I mean, I literally have usually a book beside my bed, one in the living room, and one in my car in Audible. And so I've got 2 or 3 books going at all times. Just the way I've always operated, and I love to read. But I've never fancied myself as a novelist. There are a lot of people out there that think they've got the great American novel inside of them, and all they got to do is get it out. I've never thought that. So I'm always curious about the writing process. So tell me a little bit about how you wrote these books. How did you start, and then tell us a little bit about the process.
Okay, well, it starts with an idea, like for a concept, like 2 boys going into the Bible stories through this bell tower. Fortunately, Susan took care of that for me, so I didn't have to worry too much about that part of the concept. For me, because of the genre that I'm writing, I mean, it's children's Christian fiction, I did a lot of praying to ask God, what stories do you want told? But then also, once I settled in on a story, like for the first book, the story of Genesis, with Adam and Eve, I was like, what angle do you want me to approach it from? Now, this is going to sound really weird, but it turns out that the very beginning of the book, when David goes into the bell tower for the first time, it's based on a dream that I had. It's not exactly the same as the dream, but it's based on a dream that I had that led me to go into ministry. And so as I'm writing the book, I felt like I was being told, okay, this is what that dream is about. I thought I knew what it was about 20 years ago, but now all of a sudden it's like, yeah, this is what the dream is about now, and the way to convey it in this particular book. And it's about that moment when David is just sitting there in the darkness, in the void, and suddenly he hears a low rumbling, and it's supposed to be the voice of God, and he sees this light coming at him. I got all of that from a dream that I had had a long time prior. Then the rest of it is pretty much just listening for God and paying attention to the stories of my kids and other kids that I've seen interacting with the Bible throughout time. I can tell you, I keep a running list going of problems that children face. So I've asked my kids, I've asked other kids, I have a couple-page list of problems that kids face, and I pray over that list, and then I try to listen for God telling me, this is the story that I want you to tell that will help kids deal with with one of these many problems. And then I have a phone conversation with my kids, because they're much closer to being kids than I am. Right. And I say, okay, when you were encountering, like one example is a bullying situation that occurs in the second book. I actually had a 4-way call going on with 3 different people of my kids' generation saying, how would a bullying incident like this play out? And they sat there and they started arguing with one another and saying, well, this is how it would go. No, this is how it would go. No, this is how it would go. That's my writing process. I listen for God, I talk to people, and then I start writing it down.
Well, I'm looking forward to the 4th book. I read the blurb on Amazon earlier, and each one of these, I've found that each story inspires these 2 young boys to do something in their lives, whether it's a challenge that they're facing and they learn how to deal with it, or, and it sounds like book 4 inspires them to actually get out and help others in the community. And we all need that inspiration. We all need that kind of nudge at some point. So it's not just for these 2 boys, it's for all of us.
Yeah, it is definitely for all of us. And in the 4th book, just as kind of like a little preview, it's called Love Your Neighbor. And not only are the boys inspired by God to go out and do something, to build something, to do some outreach, but once they convince their youth group to start going along with them, they get to their first project and they start working on this house, and they find out that it's the house of the bully who had been bullying David in the second book. And so David has a crisis of faith and just a crisis of his entire being, because he doesn't want to help the bully.
Sure.
And he's mad because God has been guiding him and leading him all this way, and he feels like he's been doing what God wants him to do, and God leads him to help the one person on earth who he least wants to help.
Interesting.
And that's what this story ends up being about.
Yeah, well, interesting. Interesting enough, the first very interesting episode featured an interview with a very famous bully from A Christmas Story. Scut Farkas.
Oh, yeah.
Was played by Zach Ward, who is actually the first person who was ever interviewed on this set.
Wow, that is amazing.
In that, yeah, that's kind of
He played a really good bully, too.
He did. He was quite a bully. You're right. Absolutely. All right. Well, thank you so much for being with us. I'm looking forward, as I said, to book number 4, and then whatever books come after that. So thank you for sharing the story of David and Jonathan in the Enchanted Bell Tower. We appreciate it, and glad you could be with us. Thank you to Reverend Brad Barton, author of the Enchanted Bell Tower series, set just up the road in Dexter, Missouri at the First Christian Church Bell Tower. I don't think if you go up into the bell tower at the First Christian Church that you will be transported, but it is an amazing story. And I encourage each of you to look it up. Check out these books. They're you don't have to be a third grader to really enjoy them. So you can pick them up on Amazon and other places too, but go to Amazon and find them. I think you will find them very interesting. Thanks for joining us.